In this demonstration, what I would like to do is, rather than going through the entire painting process, I want to hone in on creating detail and how much detail you put in, especially with objects, or in this case, feathers and the skin of the turkey, and how much detail to put in. And so one thing I would like you to do is, if you do want to do the entire painting, just pause it and copy it up to this stage of the painting, or just go with the photo reference that we've included and paint it as best you can. And then I want to just focus on some of these more nuanced details that we have in the end, especially the feathers. Okay, as I'm painting the feathers here, what I'm looking for is an interesting array of spacing and of shape. So instead of worrying about all the nuances at first, I'm really trying to hone in on the specific shapes, and also I'm squinting down to see the specific values that the feathers have. Now, I know there's quite a feeling of iridescence in the feathers, and so I want to be able to definitely capture that. But first, I have to get some of the shapes right. And also, I'm looking for the bits of feather that really kind of stick out, meaning the most graphic or obvious shapes first. Now, when you're trying to deal with something that's very complex, like the feathers and the skin of this turkey, what you need to do is you need to edit and design as much as ever, and maybe even more than like the stick of butter that we did, which is a much simpler shape. So when you're dealing with complexity, what you want to do is just focus on maybe the larger, more obvious areas, and the smaller, tinier little shapes and details will be edited out for the most part. So when I start to layer the skin a little bit more with a bit more texture and a little bit thicker paint, the challenge here is to not make it so peppered with little brush strokes that all the brush strokes start to look the same. And so I really need to be careful and watch out for that when I'm using the brush. So you can see one of the ways to keep the texture interesting is to have a little bit of a mix between using the corner of my brush and using the flat end of the brush, so that it creates a little bit more of that variety of stroke. Also, I'm slightly adjusting the color so that we have some variety in color tone. I'm keeping the values relatively the same though, as I'm working on this part of the skin, because I don't want to get it confused with any of the shadow values of the turkey, because all of this area that I'm working on right now is in the light. I also want to focus my attention on building up the texture in the light side, but not in the shadow side, so that I have some areas of rest. And it's better to have less detail in the shadow and more detail in the light. Now, these highlights in the head are important because it adds a greater sense of light to the piece. And it's something that I actually observe in the reference, but also it's really important just for the form. It's not necessarily as much about texture, but it is more about the form. But I'm also tailoring the highlights to match the little bumps that are going on its head. So there's a shape to the highlights. It's not just placing a stroke mindlessly. In the last 5 minutes or so, you can see that I've been really slowly painting and putting just little strokes of color. And this is where, when you're building up the detail, things have to slow down and be really thoughtful about where you're placing things and where you're deciding to put detail. Again, I'm looking at the positive and negative shapes within the turkey, and actually not seeing it as a turkey at all. I'm just looking at it as a little bit of back and forth with light side and shadow side shapes. And so just making sure there's some variety there, and also getting some of the little accents of light, and as well as just making sure and refining the shadow shapes so that it reads well from a distance. I'm going to start working on the feathers of the turkey. And as I do that, what is important is I have this kind of warm orange base, and then I'm mixing a little bit of a cooler green over the top, giving it this kind of iridescent feel. What helps give the iridescent tone is you have kind of a jarring mixture of color, where you have the warm orange underneath and then a little bit cooler green on the top. And so I haven't fully mixed the color into the canvas. You can see I'm lightly touching it over the surface so that orange can show through. Also, I want to make sure that the turkey has kind of this billowing form. So the strokes towards the top of the turkey are going to be more at an upward angle. And then the strokes for the lower part of the feathers are going to have more of a downward angle. And that will emphasize kind of the perspective that is happening there, meaning that the part on the left side of the canvas is going to be closer to us because the turkey billows outward than as you get closer to the head, which is going to be a little bit further away from us. I know that's only a couple inches, but it's important in emphasizing the rounding of the form. So I want to reflect that in the direction of the stroke. Now at the bottom here, we have a lot more warmth, so I'm adding a lot more orange, which is partly because of the reflected light that's going underneath, and partly just this is how the feathers are looking on the turkey's chest. Now I'm starting to add a little bit of these little darks to indicate the overlap of one layer of feather over another. And it's important to create a little bit more depth and by using the overlap. Now, throughout this whole process, I'm not trying to create exactly what I see, although I'm making some important observations, but I'm also looking at a nice breakup of dark and mid-tone shapes. So it should read as much like an abstract painting as it does turkey feathers. Now, as I'm painting all these colors in the feathers, I don't want to overwhelm any of the colors and textures that are going on in the head. The feathers have to be subservient to what's going on in the head. So I try not to go too much towards these super bright highlights. Now, what I'm doing here is adding a little bit of green. And again, that gives it that more iridescent color where you have more of the really warm against really cool, like the warm oranges and that cool green. It adds a nice contrast to the red skin of the turkey. Okay, at this point, what I'm going to do is take the soft mongoose hairbrush, and all I'm doing is lightly touching the surface of the canvas to take some of the glare off. So that's why you're seeing some of those darks being brought up. I'm not actually adding any sort of paint. I'm just taking the glare off of it. And you can notice that the glare will lighten colors that aren't really that light. That will about finish this demo up, and I hope you enjoy painting this turkey as much as I did.